So now we'll go into the discussion period for about 25 or so minutes. So I invite the speakers to get up, and actually all of us get up, and then let's form different discussion groups. If you want to join up, there was some uniqueness between the three topics that you had, but if it makes sense to kind of combine with the size of the group that we have, it's up to you all.
This about the success of different therapeutic modalities, and part of the challenge in the pharmaceutical industry are paying for all the failures. So the average success from phase 1 to registration is 7% for all drugs. It's 7% for oncology drugs. It's 7% for CAR-T. For rare disease genetic medicines, it's 18%, which is not 100%. And then when you think about platforms, and then which isn't really factored into that, your probability of success even goes higher. So I would challenge the fact that just because it's more complicated, that it's less likely going to be successful. In fact, one of the reasons I believe that genetic medicines are successful is we're not guessing on the relevant pathway, and we're not dealing with the typical kind of off-target toxicities that you see. We at least know what the gene is. Okay. And when genetic medicine goes beyond monogenic diseases, then the probability of success is going to plummet because you have other problems. But let's open it up for.
I actually just want to clarify a point that we are on the same page. I actually did say that the likelihood of success is higher the more complex the therapies.
Jim, you just raised a bunch of money for a novel gene therapy company here.
A bunch? I wouldn't say a bunch.
Compared to maybe like what else?
Some. But a sum is a bunch.
I'd be really intrigued in hearing, you've articulated, I think, some of the issues. What was the pitch there? What kind of interesting novel insights have you applied from, RegenX times and things like this for the next future that you were able to build like this next generation? Kind of what is the hook there with the newest, with Gemma?
Well, look, it's we're all suffering. I would say that sources of capital, we diversify sources of capital. And venture capital may not be where we're going to finance our companies. Where we have had more success are in family offices. I don't know if you know, guys. Someone's rich, they hire a group. They have a group that helps invest their money and a group that helps give away their money. And family offices are stepping up. They have sort of different risk profiles, and there is even if it's purely investment, the challenge with family offices is diligence, that they don't always understand technology. But that's where we're tapping into, and I think they're going to become more and more sophisticated. And the other interesting thing is, back in the day when it was frothy, all of the leading VCs had their pick of the litter, and the family offices were listen to me. Well, when they've moved out of the way, the family offices see that as an opportunity. The other aspect that I didn't mention is our notion about private-public partnerships, where we partner with a government who's a payer, get at-risk capital in return for a reduced price. We did that in Brazil. We're doing that in Abu Dhabi, and we have 3 other governments. And believe it or not, we write grants, actually. And more grant givers and makers, and those that support sort of translational research are more keen on organizations that are not just there for publication, promotion, and patents, but are there for moving the needle. So I would say, whoever you are as a CEO, you have to diversify your funding base, and there may be some VCs that would step to the plate, and also investment outside the United States. I think there's going to be increasingly proportionate to that.
Maybe to add to that, for the sake of clarity, Jefferson and Friends is a family office. It's the family office of Tony James, the former president and vice chairman of Blackstone. And what makes us very unique is that we are also sophisticated. So my team and my background, is in science. I've been a scientist, an entrepreneur, an operator, so diligence happens more like a VC than a family office. And that allows us to have, on one hand, the financing structures that are more flexible, evergreen funds, patient capital. I don't need to invest if I don't see anything interesting. And when we do invest, we have that long-term view. But at the same time, because of my background and my team's background, we are very active investors. We sit on the board. We help the company through our network, operational expertise, and so on. And we are not the only ones. Right, there are other family offices that are developing this model of sort of hiring MDs and PhDs and people with operational experience and investment experience to enable this space. And the rationale behind that, why this and not real estate, and why this or not only real estate, is that there's always going to be patients. There's always going to be technology advances, right? So there's always going to be value created here. It's a question of finding the right structure and finding the right enablers for the companies. But an important thing to say is that in this space, there's no single entity that can carry the investment for the entirety of its lifespan, right? It's not enough to have one family office like us that has this combination. There needs to be a shift in how people think about this type of investments for it to be enabled, because it's 7% or 4%, depending on the modality success rate, and it's hundreds of millions of dollars that it takes to bring a therapy to commercial stage. So,
Question?
So I guess my question is it possible, or do you envision it to be possible, to bring subject to commercialization of how a pharma works?
Absolutely. We have to think that. Otherwise, we are beholden to the investment profile of the pharmaceutical industry. We've got to do it ourselves. And biotech generally has not been a commercializer. My view is, if we're trying to compete in markets where there are enormous markets and enormous competition, we can't. But that's not what we're doing here. Yeah. These specialized centers of excellence is a theme.
Yeah, I agree with Jim a lot on if you cut out the sales team. So when you try to market a drug that has $1 billion plus revenue annually, right? You have runway that you're trying to go elbows out with the other people who've chased that same $1 billion drug. And what that means is you end up setting up your biggest booth with the most attractive people at big conventions and stuff. That all costs a ton of money, right? And so there's a world in which you take an approach like what Jim is taking and saying, where are the rare disease patient foundations? Where are the treating physicians, right? Where are these centers that are delivering these therapies? You go directly to them. You say, here is, we're not intending to find billion-dollar molecules. I'm sorry if I'm speaking for you, but I'm saying there's that, 300 to 1,000 patient population are incredibly meaningful for revenue, but not the blockbuster ones that folks are going after. And I think that is a very valid approach to take and say, we're changing our cost structure of actually commercializing these drugs without a big sales team that we pay commission and set up conference booths and everything.
Other questions? Yeah, over there.
You reference, Winston, in your slides, the payers looking for reimbursement. Is that really a future? Do you really think the payers are going to step up and cover this? Or have to raise them to cover not just the development action?
So really good question. I mean, I think there's probably three phases, right? There's what I call the priming the pump phase right now, where you do on these platforms to establish initial safety and efficacy, to show that this model works. There will require some just investment, whether it's from philanthropy, from grants, from some of the sources that Jim was talking about. I think there's an intermediate phase where you can convince government payers, Medicare, Medicaid, that are very interested. This current administration, surprisingly, is incredibly interested in genetic therapies that treat the root cause. And therefore, it fits the agenda of saying, oh, we're not reliant on pharmaceuticals and, the revenue from 80 years worth of charging a kid and their lifelong, medication needs. So you end up having the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation have reached out to us to say, we want to explore more of how this works. And we think a solution to give them is say, price these like surgeries, right? It's a bone marrow transplant itself is $500,000, but if you add on all the ancillary care, it's could be 1 or 2 million, right? Liver transplants, millions of dollars. Where you get into the challenge with some of the commercial payers is that they're in it not to optimize, and this is a very US-centric problem with so much of the private health insurance, of saying they're not in it necessarily to optimize the long-term health. They're thinking about the returns from their portfolio. They have insurance against liver transplants. There's like, it's turtles all the way down of just different insurance products and stuff, just to make sure that if someone requires a gene therapy that costs a couple $1 million, suddenly it's, going to cause them to default on their, insurance and stuff. So I feel like having the government actually step in and say, this is an important thing we're willing to pay for, will drive a lot of tailwinds with that phase 3 where we're talking about of getting the private insurers to actually pay for these life-altering therapies.
But to that point, where we've had success in our public-private partnership, like the Ministry of Health in Brazil, reporting to them is Anvisa that approves the products, CMED that prices it, and then Conitec under their public health system that pays for it. That's one person. And they are responsible for providing healthcare in their country. That's literally the way that healthcare is reimbursed outside of the United States.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, when that's the case, there's enormous tension between citizens of that country who want access to those treatments, and the government becomes highly contentious and highly political. And the government is put in a situation where they're looking for solutions. They just can't say, I'm Blue Cross, you can go run over here, or I have a reinsurer. So in many ways, I think it's going to be easier to come up with some solutions outside the United States than it would be inside the United States.
I just want to say that the surgeries cost that, and that's not being dressed up as.
It's true. But, very few insurance companies pay list price for like Zolgensma too, right?
Other questions?
Or your thoughts, right? Like your ideas, right? This is.
That's a question about like your proposal was that like critical data shared on your industry partner and centers of excellence. You might be able to create a FI deal where this is how it's like curious industry partner perspective, your perspective, like what scale do you need to achieve for it to actually deliver balanced version of purpose? Space say, is no I know 5 into gigabit reach 10, 100, where it's actually be valuable.
So I'll take a step at it because a lot of sophisticated investors have said exactly this. Like, what is your kind of minimum viable insight bolus? And I would say actually at different scales of patient numbers, you already have different levels of feedback, right? An N of 5, industry is very interested in regulatory engagements, right? Like how do they think about an AAV and the tox package that might need to go in, or, CMC, like those are all things that could save hundreds of millions of dollars for a full commercial product, that some of those insights are already valuable even in a few interaction. And then you start thinking about platform safety, efficacy, different trial designs. I think that's as you move into more, like it becomes more routine and you have a structured way of collecting the data, you might be able to see class-wide safety on, say, lipid nanoparticle gene editors, right?
I have a question for the group here. There was this committee at NIH called RAC. Does anyone know what RAC, who knows what RAC stands for, if you could raise your hand? Stunning, absolutely stunning. So regarding data sharing, some really important history. 52 years ago, when recombinant DNA was discovered, there was enormous societal concern about recombinant E. coli taking over our sewers. In Cambridge, the city council shut down research, recombinant DNA research, if you remember that. The scientists got together and they convened at a Silmar conference in Southern California and said, we've got to put something into place to regain society, the confidence of society. They brought the government in. They created, as part of NIH, an Institutional Biohazard Safety Committee. So if you wanted to do recombinant DNA research, you had to file that so that it was available to the NIH and was available to the public. And recombinant DNA took off. Then we wanted to put genes into humans. Oh my God. Back then when I was involved, you wouldn't believe the concerns there were by many stakeholders. They then put together a requirement that if you as an institution receive NIH funding and you or your PI wants to do research in gene transfer or gene therapy, you have to submit that to a committee called the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, and that And what you were doing was available to anyone in the public. And if it was really innovative, you had to come to quarterly meetings and 18-member committee of patient advocates, ethicists, and basically put on your hair shirt and hear their concerns. Now, they didn't have any regulatory approval. That is how we were able to launch gene therapy. Otherwise, it would have been dead in the water. One of the consequences is whenever there was a safety signal in any trial, it came to the RAC. We all convened, genome integration, capsid T cells, Jesse Gelsinger's death, whatever it was, we would convene as a community and basically hash it out. So everyone had access to that. Now, at some point, when gene engineering became more routine, it was viewed by many as an additional hurdle that we didn't need. And my concern was we would lose this opportunity. What I'm worried about is the pace of discovery is stunning, absolutely stunning, which means the translation to human is going to be even more complicated, and we're going to be dealing with more issues than we did before. And we need to put into place a way for there to be transparency, especially for these safety signals. And I don't know the way, and if we don't figure it out, someone may impose something on us. And the RAC conjures up all kinds of tortuous sort of experiences, which, believe me, I didn't enjoy most of them myself when I was put before the RAC. But maybe this kind of consortium. But if we don't do this, let alone creating value for investors, but losing confidence of the patients that we're serving, losing confidence of society, we are at the same view that we were in Asilomar and when we put the RAC. I think that's how critically important this moment in time is. And there are some horrific, horrible adverse events that have occurred, that are occurring, that there is no visibility to what's going on. And that is something that really can't go on.
I have a question for you, Winston.
Yeah.
So when you think about the platform that's like can enable gene therapies across many, many different diseases, do you have numbers for example, how many diseases impact the liver, the pancreas, the brain, how many of them where the damage happens during embryonic development and it's too late, to try to get sort of pool numbers?
I mean, I do, but also every single consulting firm in Boston has those numbers and big databases that they'll charge you around $300,000 to access and say like, hey, if I slice and dice this way, here's your indication strategy. And so those things are available of saying what's amenable to treatment, what organs are needed to treat, and also, what's the modality of treatment? Is it gene augmentation? Is it a base correction? Is it splice modulating? So those exist, and it's how people have cut them that have really made, what the programs you see in portfolios today. So,
because
back to the rat concept. So the speed at which China expands the gene therapies and genetic process, so how IITs are being run, is anything like that happening there, where there's more transparency in data sharing that the government might be aware of?
I mean, not that I'm aware of. I would doubt it, but
What kind of follow-up on that? Do you see things happening there that you think you should either learn from, or in both directions, good or bad, to stay sort of, or everything they're talking about is, a lot of US based, but the current base about, speak to PSC, which I'm early about, and expanded beyond the US. Do you have any thoughts on sort of what's the process?
I've got a few, and this was from a month and a half ago going to China. So one of them, to answer your first question, I think they've come at it at a different way of saying we're going to put a lot of onus on the investigator versus centralizing safety learning and stuff. It's that you as the investigator, it's separate from a health authority, have the responsibility of the safety and efficacy. So you get a spectrum of trial quality data, but the best ones are reporting out our reliable data. Whether it's safety events, can we actually say the safety events were true things that we would classify as AEs, or is it, those are all things I think that there is some question. They're trying to follow GCP more, good clinical practice more rigorously and stuff. So hopefully that answers your first thing. I think they've just decentralized it. To the second point of what are things we can learn, I actually think that same institution-based approvals, right? These investigator-initiated trials, they have no real safeguards on it of just being like, okay, if you're an institution, the onus is on you to figure out if it's safe and the benefit risk makes sense for your patients. I think in the US, we can still learn from these accredited centers model where the FDA always says we want to learn alongside the developers, right? The problem is the learning cycle takes so long, and then like draft guidances take years to get into real guidances, et cetera. If they trust and put a framework in place to supervise people, the ones who have the greatest knowledge in a particular area of genetic medicine development, I think there's an opportunity to move faster. And if there's a requirement to then move data into a pre-competitive space to learn together, like the RAC concept, or otherwise through nonprofit consortia, that is something I think we can really do to accelerate the speed to proof of concept, without giving up rigor.
Yeah, but I think we have to be. I'm worried about what's happening in China. While the net result being speed, in drug development, there are some things you sort of have to do. And in the lab, you can make discoveries literally incredibly quickly. But we may not be the best model, and maybe there's somewhere in between. But I have concerns, and ultimately, what we've learned is that can lead to setbacks. I've been involved in one of those myself.
Yeah.
And so there, maybe we can learn from some of the things that they're doing, but I just have concerns. I'll just say that.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to, in the discussion at this point, it's been great. We've got some roundtables coming up this afternoon, and actually this whole data sharing idea, there's a number of roundtables that's going to dive into this. So I encourage you all to keep the conversation going there. And thank you, Jim, Winston, and Laura for giving your talk and having this insightful conversation.